Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, the matter before us today is one that signals, I hope, to the people of Barbados, in fact, to the region and to the hemisphere in which we live, this government's approach to an understanding of what it takes to manage and maintain a society. This legislation dealing with the matter of family leave is timely to the extent that it comes among, and one of the things to which I always refer, sir, is the question of policy coherence. No one piece of legislation on its own will be capable of achieving everything that a society wants to achieve. But I am satisfied, sir, that this Barbados Labour Party government is one that across every discipline, across every area, across every theme of its work, seeks to align its policies and seeks to make them real and material in the lives of Barbadians. And so today, this legislation is really at the heart of what keeps a population and a society ticking over, what keeps it going. The idea of reproduction is not just about physical reproduction. What we are talking about here is the question of social reproduction. What are the activities and the supporting policies that allow for the well-being of people in all of their facets and elements and the ways in which they exist? And so I rise to lend my support to this legislation and to say a bit, sir, about the direction in which it goes and also about the range of policy considerations that we have to complete in order to make this legislation real and material, and so that it exists alongside other things that people need in order to improve their well-being. But sir, I will start at the point of the language, because I think that one of the things, words matter, and one of the things that I am happy to associate myself, with which I'm happy to associate myself when it comes to this government and this Barbados Labour Party administration, is that we are meaningful in what we say. We are meaningful in our language, at least I assume that we intend to be and we aim to be. And so the member for St. Peter, not much of what I say today will surprise him, because most of what I say today I have said to him. Certainly the fact that the choice was made to repeal the existing legislation and replace it is, I think, an indication that we have to step away from 1978. The fact that we had something called an Employment of Women Maternity Leave Act suggests to me that everything that we had to consider with respect to the employment of women could be encapsulated in maternity. So we called the legislation the Employment of Women Act, because all we cared about, it seems at that time, in terms of women being in the workplace, was about their status, whether they were pregnant or non-pregnant. And so already, by rejecting this nomenclature, by setting it aside and saying, listen, employment of women relates to all kinds of things, not just their maternity and not just their reproductive roles. So that's the first indication, I think, that we're moving in the right direction. I would have hoped, though, that we had removed the use of the term confinement, which is a 19th century reference that really describes the experience of going into labor and delivery. And one of the reasons it was called at the time confinement is that at that time, for most of that century, men were excluded from the birthing room. Men were excluded from the birthing room even as medical practitioners. So in fact, men only came to be involved in labor and delivery as medical professionals when somebody decided that it was high science. All along, midwives were doing it, female relatives were doing it, were the ones delivering babies because it was something that, oh, we shouldn't trouble men's sensibilities with this thing. All this baby business is not for men. So even doctors were not involved in delivery. But then somebody decided, you know what? This is important work. So get rid of the women from both here. Let's make midwifery secondary to medicine. And that was when men started to be involved in the delivery of babies. But men were not just excluded as medical practitioners, they were excluded as fathers. They were literally not allowed to witness the act of labor and delivery. And in fact, one had to clean up the child sufficiently that a man's delicate sensibilities could bear witness to this thing. So, I mean, I'm sure many of us have seen the videos of men fainting in the delivery room. A woman has just literally given birth herself, and poor him, he can't take on the sight of the event, right? But this is where the term confinement really came from, this notion that a woman had to be separated and kept away from real life and the real business of society while she was in the family way and while she was giving birth. And then it also came to be known as, to be associated with recovery, with which I have no objection, right? Because I do think it started to realize that women have a right to recuperate and recover, and that gave way, especially in Eastern practices, for family members to come over and help and make sure that the woman was resting and that there were other people who were playing this role. But I do think that it is important in our language not to use this delicate term to talk about things that we all need in order to reproduce our society. These questions today of social reproduction and of practical, literal, physical reproduction are everybody's business. Because we cannot reproduce the society, the labor force, workers, students, scientists, doctors. We cannot reproduce these people if we did not make provisions for this reproduction in all its forms. So I do think that I would like to suggest that if we're talking about labor and delivery, let's talk about labor and delivery. If we're talking about pregnancy, let's call it pregnancy. Because the sooner we call these things what they are, the closer the society as a whole gets an understanding of what it takes to run a society. Let's not treat these things as delicate issues. So, sir, I certainly would be in favor of modernizing the language as we are modernizing the policy here today. But, sir, I also want to highlight that what we need to continue, as this legislation does, to promote is the idea of a life cycle approach to social care and social protection. And what do I mean by that? This legislation, and I'll talk briefly a little bit later about what are some of the things that recommend it. But this legislation focuses on, as it should, and is very progressive in the way that it focuses on sharing of care responsibility between mothers and fathers. And I am encouraged by the Honourable Member for St. Peter's disclosure today that future iterations or future development will include the addition of adopted children to families, so that we will then be extending family leave in cases where a family adopts a child. But, sir, there are so many other considerations when it comes to how a society reproduces itself and all of these stages of that. Sir, the issue is not so much, as we grapple with population issues, it's not just about the issue of pregnancy and delivery. It is about the question of fertility. It is about the question of fertility. The life cycle of a person, a woman who, so far to my knowledge, is the only one of us who can physically give birth. But that life cycle includes other things and other stages before we get to a live birth. And the fact is that there are all kinds of invisible parts of this fertility experience. And while this extension of maternity leave and inclusion of paternity leave are very important to support that, in general, policies that support fertility, policies that support the entire experience of families that are in the process of expanding themselves, those are the kinds of policies that are important. Sir, one of the stages, I would say, in a woman's life or in a family's life when it comes to reproduction is pregnancy loss. Now, there are many women who, before we all see and celebrate a child, who experience pregnancy loss. The UK, earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, introduced in their bereavement leave something called parental bereavement leave. So, standard in most legislation of this kind is that from 25 weeks, as the member who introduced the legislation outlined, from 25 weeks, it is considered a viable pregnancy. And if there is a stillbirth at that time, most jurisdictions still allow for maternity leave, but really you are looking at pregnancy and maternity from 25 weeks. And anything that happens up to 24 weeks is not even contemplated. But sir, most pregnancy loss happens in the first 12 weeks of gestation. And there is some pregnancy loss that also happens up to 24 weeks. And the fact is that while it does not result in a live birth, it is something that an employee has to deal with. As the honorable member said, it is not sickness or illness to the extent that it's a natural process. And so the question of how do we manage loss in families? How do we signal to employees, women who are experiencing these issues, that they don't have to try and beg for an extra day or two to mourn the loss of their child or to deal with the physical recovery? Sir, I know from very recent personal experience of the difficulties that come when one experiences a pregnancy loss in one's family. And I know that it is not spoken about. It is one of the things that we feel that we either whisper about or we wonder about and we don't talk about. But the fact is that a government, the state, must invest in the kinds of policies that support women's fertility at every stage, and also that support questions of infertility. How is it that we can help women who are in some other stage of their fertility journey? And this is not just about reproduction. This is not just about having a child, but this is about all the ways in which a woman is a woman. The honorable member who introduced the legislation talks a lot about things like breastfeeding in the workplace. And how do we make sure that women are supported in these kinds of reproductive activities? So, sir, what I would like to see alongside and along with this kind of legislation is legislation that, in an outright way, supports those of us who have experienced the loss of pregnancy and who are, and who may be in a fertility journey that really one does not want to discuss or submit documentation to be able to manage. And how do we introduce things like parental bereavement leave and other kinds of leave that help people in that journey? Sir, the legislation also really starts to open up some deeper issues about how we handle family law matters. Now, when it comes to the question of establishing paternity in the legislation, what the bill calls for is signed documentation from the mother stating that this man is the father of the child. Now, this is standard, I think, across our law. There are distinctions between how married people are treated and how others are treated. And so it is assumed that if I am married and I have a child, my married partner is the partner to whom I'm married is the father of the child. As it should rightly be assumed.
Oh, no, that's a rebuttable presumption in law. That is what we call in law a rebuttable presumption.
Yes.
Just for the...
That is what it is called in law.
That is correct terminology.
And in a case where there is a union other than marriage, then I have to prove certain things with respect to, well, not prove, but I certainly have to claim certain things. There's no assumptions being made, understandably, I suppose, but I still think it bears a second look to see whether this is really a kind of bifurcation of rights that is happening here. But we can come to that. I'm sure we'll get to that in other family law conversations, sir. But the point that I am trying to make here is that this legislation throws up some other considerations. And one of them has to do with the establishment of paternity. How do we as a society treat the establishment of paternity, which is really the legal claim of fatherhood? Now, we've seen, sir, all kinds of scenarios where paternity is brought into question, and one might suggest that once and for all, there has to be a mechanism for the clear establishment of paternity. So, jurisdictions treat it in different ways, but it is certainly something that, alongside this legislation of this kind, and I'm not at all suggesting that this legislation should deal with that matter, but alongside legislation of this kind, these are the kinds of things that we have to explore. Sir, further to that, we have to do better on decisions related to custody and maintenance and dissolution of marriage. I have seen far, far, far too many scenarios within and outside of marriage, within common law unions, in visiting relationships, where families are not allowed to progress, children are not allowed to know their non-custodial parent because of at the discretion of a single person. These things cannot continue in a progressive Barbados. And often, these things are bound up in the dissolution of a marriage. And notwithstanding what the legislation says about how custody matters can be settled separately or property matters can be settled separately, I am not satisfied, sir, that we are giving children their best shot at knowing who their parents are, getting the full benefit of relationships with both parents, with both sides of the family, because the minister, the honorable member for St. Peter who introduced this legislation, left it at the point of encouraging parents too. He said, I would encourage parents not to, and I'm paraphrasing, to keep the children at the center of these conversations and, mediate. That would be good. Notwithstanding that, the court, the judicial system, has a role to play in situations where these matters come before the court. And I am not satisfied that when it comes to questions of family law, that the decisions are sufficiently timely. We are talking about, in many cases, about custody matters of children. So a child stops being a child at 18 years old. And so if at the point of a dissolution of a marriage, the child is 10, and there's no judgment for 7 or 8 years, well, that situation has ended. And this is not an anecdote, sir. This is something of which I have personal experience. That children now do not have the option to know the non-custodial parent because a court has failed to act in a timely way. It cannot continue, and I will go further. While we focus on criminal matters, while we focus on law reform with respect to criminal matters, I will say this, and the Honourable Member for St. Joseph, the Honourable Attorney General, said it in recent remarks in this honourable place, that there's only so far you can go on the law and order side of things when it comes to addressing crime. We seem to think that family law and how families function is separate from criminal activity and what is happening with criminal behavior in this country. They are not separate. And until we get that right, alongside all of the other measures that are being taken that are necessary, if we do not strengthen the entitlements that children have to be considered and to be included in the way in which the court functions and the family court functions and its efficiency, we are not in anything. Because a lot of what we are trying to solve begins and ends in the home. And so while we encourage family participation, sharing of care responsibility, we can't just do it with respect to measures like this. We have to be able to do it across the family law system, because there are children today who are suffering from not having access. And there are fathers or mothers who are likewise suffering from not having access. And, sir, we talk about integrity, and we propose all kinds of codes of conduct and all kinds of things for those of us that sit in this honorable chamber. But those of us who sit in judgment, those of us who are judicial officers, those of us who are judges, those of us who have to make decisions that affect family, also have to be held to a standard of performance. And I am not satisfied that that standard of performance has been established and is being upheld with respect to family law matters. Sir, so beyond the establishment of paternity, which I think we have to be able to come to terms with, and there are all kinds of other things associated with this. So, for example, registration of births is another area that I think is low-hanging fruit. So this question of having to walk to the court and hold up the baby like this is Lion King and say, here is the baby and here is the father, and is almost like you bring the father by the ears to come and say, this is him here. A woman who's married doesn't have to do that. She doesn't have to suffer that, well, what might be indignity depending on these circumstances. But sir, there's an easy solution for that, which is that the registration of a birth can happen at the hospital. The child is born at the hospital. And in fact, one of the suggestions that I made here today is that we get the father involved before it is time to distribute a benefit. Because in general, in the public health system in Barbados, a woman is registered with the public health system for antenatal classes, for antenatal care, and you can give her the option at that time to identify the father at that time when she presents herself to a polyclinic. No, I mean, there's nothing precluding her from saying at 6 weeks or 10 weeks or 15 weeks, this is the father. He's come willingly to be involved in birthing classes or whatever it is that are on offer, and understanding the process of pregnancy and postpartum and so on. There's nothing stopping that man, that father, from being registered in the system at that time. And in fact, if we really want to encourage Barbadians, men and women, to share care responsibilities, that would be the time to involve the father. So you say, okay, well, this woman is involved in antenatal care and classes and appointments, register the father then. And then, the birth, when it happens, if it happens, invariably in the public health system, it is happening at the Queen's Elizabeth Hospital. And so everything that you need to be able to register that birth is there. You have the father in the system. I'm not saying that we're going to have 100% uptake from the outset. We might have less than the 50% the honorable member quoted earlier. But at least it is an option. You have the father in the system. The birth certificate is generated. It is literally a certificate of birth. It is certifying that this child has been born here on this day. It happened right there in the hospital. Why would we go anywhere else to register the birth? No, you may need to transmit that information. I'm told no, it will be done by the Electoral and Boundaries Commission. You may now need to transmit that information electronically, securely, from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital on the same platform to the EBC. Then you have your registration of births and deaths. I do not know why we are requiring people to bring a newborn child and a hapless man, which is the way it's presented sometimes, to a court to say yes, and a woman who happens to have a ring on her finger is spared that. So, sir, these issues all hang together. One of the other, I did not hear, and perhaps I may have missed it, it was an expansive and quite thorough and useful presentation, but I did not hear reference to self-employed, the status of the self-employed in this legislation. And I know that the honorable member for St. Peter is listening closely and may want in his wrap-up to reiterate, if he has already mentioned, how these benefits affect self-employed individuals. But there's another provision that obtains in some jurisdictions where the spousal maternity benefit of a man then attaches to his partner. So what it means, and I heard the honorable leader of the opposition trying to come to terms with this issue of being employed 12 months. I will let the honorable member for St. Peter respond to that because he has endless time and I have limited time. But I heard him grappling with it as if it was some kind of alien idea when it is that provision exists across all legislation of this nature with varying thresholds for employment. But I won't speak too deeply to that, no. But one of the ways in which that is cured in some jurisdictions is that if I, the man, the father, have been employed at a firm for 5 years, and my partner, the mother, has just recently gained employment, the maternity benefit is a spousal maternity benefit. Remember, this is a family leave question. So my partner and I are having a child. And so I am entitled to a maternity benefit for a woman. I, as the father, can attach my maternity benefit to my partner. It happens in many insurance schemes, for example. And so if I've been employed for 5 years, and my partner has just started The fact is that one of us has been employed for more than the stipulated time. And so she gets that benefit by proxy of me being the father. Now, I know perhaps better than most what the financial viability of the national insurance, I don't ever remember all the S's now, but the fund looks like. And so I know that some of the things that we explore in here today have to be costed and have to be proven to be financially viable. I understand that. But I do think that these are things, when it comes to parental bereavement leave for pregnancy loss and other kinds of loss, when it comes to the establishment of paternity, when it comes to spousal maternity benefits that attach through a man to his partner, that these are things that we have to explore in order to make sure that there are no gaps in coverage in the system. Sir, I think what I would like to say finally is that I am encouraged by what is represented here today. But I'm further encouraged by what has been outlined as the future direction for the consideration of family leave. One, that parents decide together who will take how much leave. And this is about more than just the delivery of care in the postpartum period. This is also about the income and the potential income losses from a woman being, as the member for St. Peter would like to say, confined, versus a man. So a couple may wish to be able to make a choice about who goes back to work earlier, because if I am earning at a higher level as the mother, then, buddy, you can stay home because you have money to make. So you stay home because you're earning at a lower level. I need to get back out there and keep this thing running so that we can continue to live our lives at the level to which we've all become accustomed. And so it is very important, I think, that we move quickly beyond this question of maternity and paternity leave to real, true family leave, so that this decision can be made between the couple and communicated to the authorities. I have to reiterate that as government has made certain pronouncements about things like fostering and expanding families in all kinds of ways, certainly for the question of adoption, bringing a new child into a home requires a period of adjustment, and it should be treated just like a maternity leave or a maternity benefit, because in many cases it requires even more of an adjustment. I've had recent personal experience with a friend who has brought a child from another culture, does not speak the language, does not understand how we are living as Barbadians, from miles and miles away, and now has to adjust and acclimatize, and time is needed for that to take place. And then finally, sir, the question of surrogacy. I don't know how this legislation is treating surrogacy, but I imagine that there will be a time in which we also bring the question of surrogacy into legislation, that we make sure that we acknowledge and include mothers who are giving birth on behalf of another family into the fabric of what keeps our society going. I am sure, as my mother would say, I'm most certain that I heard earlier references to acknowledging or making provisions for surrogate parenting to happen in our own jurisdiction here. And at such time as that happens, then this legislation will have to contemplate that and figure out where it fits, so that there will need to be a period of recuperation for the surrogate mother, even though she is not raising the child. And so there will also need to be a period where the custodial mother will need to come in, and that will also throw up some interesting provisions, I imagine, under this legislation. But sir, I am very encouraged that this is where we are today. I know that, as happens whenever new legislation is introduced or new ideas are tested, that people will have feelings and thoughts, and that is good. But I think that we have to move. We can't just sit and try to get everything perfect, especially in cases where the experimentation will not cause harm. Especially in cases where the experimentation will not cause harm. We're trying a new system. We are offering greater benefits than were there before. Now, would we like to be like Canada and stay home for a year with our children? Yes. But we cannot afford that at the moment. And arguably, perhaps Canada cannot either. And so when we consider questions of socialized healthcare, when we consider questions of social protection, we have to always be able to match it with affordability and financial viability. And in that framework, I believe that this legislation is pushing all of those boundaries. That this legislation goes to the very ends of what we have deemed we can afford and starts to make real progressive steps within the confines of what this government can afford today, what people have said they need, the co-occurring investment in parenting classes, some of the investments that we hear that we expect to be made in education, from the Honourable Member for St. James North that he made this morning. This is what I call policy coherence. Now, we have to walk the walk, we have to do the fine work, we have to execute. All of that is a given. But sir, this legislation gives a clear signal, I feel, to Barbadians, to women, to men, to families, that this government supports each individual and their potential, and each family and what is needed in order to make sure that our society functions in a healthy way that supports people's well-being. And so with that, sir, I commend this bill, and I thank the Honourable Chamber for its time.